I, 68, F, stood on the porch of the lake house, the one my husband and I built with our own hands. Every plank of wood held a memory. The annual family reunion was supposed to be a time of joy, a celebration of the life we had created. But this year, something felt different. There was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the late summer breeze coming off the water. It was a coldness that radiated from my own family. My daughter, Sarah, who was usually so warm, now spoke to me in short, careful sentences. My grandson, Kyle, 22, barely looked at me at all. He seemed more interested in his phone than in the grandmother who had taught him how to fish from this very dock. The whispers started almost as soon as everyone arrived. I would walk into a room, and the conversation would stop. I would see heads leaning together, then quickly pulling apart. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling grew, a knot tightening in my stomach. Later that afternoon, I was in the kitchen preparing lemonade when I heard Sarah and her husband, Mark, talking in the hallway. Their voices were low, but the old house had a way of carrying sounds. "She's not going to like it," Sarah said. Her voice was strained. "She'll get over it," Mark replied, his tone dismissive. "It's for the best. We need to be practical about this." Practical? Dad loved this place more than anything. And Dad's gone, Sarah. We have to think about the future. Kyle's future. My hands froze on the pitcher. They were talking about me. They were talking about the house. I stepped quietly to the kitchen door and listened. "Kyle agrees with me," Mark continued. "He says she can't manage a property this size anymore. It's becoming a burden on her." A burden? This house was my heart. It was my connection to my late husband, Richard. Every morning I woke up and saw the sunrise he loved. Every evening I watched the sunset from the porch swing he built. It was not a burden. It was my home. The knot in my stomach turned to a block of ice. I wanted to storm out there and demand to know what they were planning. But I held myself back. Richard had always told me to gather the facts before starting a battle. So I stayed silent, my mind racing. I needed to know exactly what they were talking about. Later, I found my granddaughter, Chloe, sitting alone by the water's edge, skipping stones across the surface. She was Kyle's younger sister, a quiet and thoughtful girl. She had always been closer to me than her brother had. I sat down on the grass beside her. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" I asked gently. She shrugged, not looking at me. "I guess so." "You seem sad," I said. "Is it something to do with your mother and father?" She threw another stone, watching it bounce 3 times before sinking. "They're just talking about stuff." "What kind of stuff?" I pressed, keeping my voice soft. "I heard them mention the house." Chloe finally turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and worry. "Grandma, I'm not supposed to say anything." "It's okay, Chloe," I said, placing a hand on her arm. "Whatever it is, I need to know. Your mother and father seem to think I'm too fragile to handle the truth." "I promise you I'm not." She took a deep breath. "They want to sell the house," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They've been talking about it for weeks. They think it's too much for you to keep up with, and they say the money would be better for Kyle's new business idea." The ice block in my stomach shattered, sending a painful cold through my entire body. It was worse than I thought. They weren't just talking. They had been planning. For weeks. Behind my back. They had decided my home, my life's work with Richard, was nothing more than a source of cash for my grandson's latest whim. "Does Kyle want this too?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Chloe nodded miserably. "He's the one pushing for it the most. He says this place is old and falling apart. He says it's time for our family to be more forward-thinking." Forward-thinking. I thought about the hours Richard and I had spent sanding these floors, painting these walls, planting the garden that still bloomed every spring. We were thinking forward. We were building a legacy, a place where our family could gather for generations. A place that our grandson now saw as nothing more than a pile of old wood standing in a way of his ambitions. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. This was not about my ability to manage the property. This was about greed and a profound lack of respect. That evening, the family gathered for dinner on the screened-in porch. The air was thick with unspoken tension. I watched Kyle across the table. He was laughing loudly at something on his phone, completely oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the turmoil he was causing. I decided it was time to bring the whispers out into the open. "Sarah," I began, my voice clear and steady. "I overheard you and Mark talking earlier. You seemed concerned about me managing this house." Sarah froze, a fork halfway to her mouth. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "It was nothing. Just idle chatter." "It didn't sound like idle chatter," I said, my eyes not leaving hers. "It sounded like you were making plans for my future without including me." Kyle looked up from his phone, an annoyed expression on his face. "What's the big deal? We were just saying it's a lot of work for one person." "This house is my home, Kyle," I said directly to him. "It is not a lot of work, it is my life." "Well, maybe you need a different life," he shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. "One that's a little more manageable. You're not as young as you used to be, Grandma." The insult hung in the air. Manageable. He said it as if I were a pet or a piece of furniture that needed to be moved to a more convenient location. Sarah quickly jumped in, trying to smooth things over. "Kyle, that's not what we meant," she said, glaring at her son. Then she turned to me, her voice syrupy sweet. "Mom, we just worry about you out here, all alone. We were thinking about options, that's all. We would never do anything without talking to you first." It was a lie. Chloe's confession proved it was a lie. They weren't thinking about options. They had already made a decision. I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had raised to be honest and kind, and I saw a stranger. Someone who would lie to my face to get what she wanted. I knew then that this was not a conversation I was going to win tonight. They had their story and they were sticking to it. But I had the truth. And I was just getting started. I needed more than just whispers and a guilty confession from a scared teenager. I needed proof. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. The house was quiet, filled with the soft light of dawn. I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was Richard's house as much as it was mine, and I would not let them take it away without a fight. I started in the small study off the living room, a room Mark often used as a makeshift office when they visited. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I trusted my instincts. I sifted through piles of mail and old magazines on the desk. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I noticed the bottom drawer of the desk was slightly ajar. I pulled it open. It was filled with old tax documents and instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned. I started to close it, but something caught my eye. Tucked underneath a thick manual for a dishwasher we had replaced a decade ago was a glossy, full-color brochure. My heart started to pound as I pulled it out. The cover showed a picture of a modern, sterile-looking condominium complex. The title read, "Lakeside Landing, the Future of Waterfront Living." I flipped it open. Inside were floor plans, artists' renderings, and a list of amenities. And then I saw it. On the last page, there was a map of the proposed development. It was centered directly on our property. My property. They had already found a buyer. They had already seen what they wanted to build in place of our home. My hands were shaking. This was not just talk, this was a plan in motion. Tucked inside the brochure was a single folded sheet of paper. I carefully unfolded it. It was a preliminary sales agreement. It listed a potential buyer, Oak Ridge Development LLC, and a sale price. I gasped when I saw the number. It was low. Shockingly low. For a prime piece of lakefront property, it was a fraction of what it should have been. It made no sense. Why would they agree to sell it for so little? Unless they were in a hurry. Unless they were trying to hide the true value of the deal. The betrayal was a physical blow. It felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. My own daughter and grandson were not just trying to sell my home. They were trying to cheat me. They were working with a developer, hiding the details from me, and planning to give away our family's legacy for pennies on the dollar. I sat down heavily in the old leather chair, the brochure and agreement clutched in my hand. For a moment, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. How could I fight this? They were younger, more ruthless. They saw me as old and weak, an obstacle to be managed. But then I thought of Richard. I thought of his strong hands building the stone fireplace, his laughter echoing through the halls. He never backed down from a fight when he knew he was right. And neither would I. They had underestimated me. They saw an old woman. They were about to see a fighter. I folded the papers neatly and tucked them into the pocket of my robe. I would not confront them with this yet. Not until I understood the whole picture. I needed more information. Why the low price? Who was Oak Ridge Development? And what was my son-in-law's role in all of this? The fight for my home had just begun. I waited until after breakfast. The family was scattered around the property, enjoying the sunny morning. Kyle and some of his cousins were down by the dock, preparing for a day of water skiing. Sarah and Mark were reading on the porch. I chose my moment carefully. I walked out onto the porch, the brochure hidden in the large pocket of my gardening apron. I held a cup of coffee in my hand, trying to appear casual. "Sarah," I said, my voice even. "I was doing some tidying up in the study this morning, and I found this." I pulled out the brochure and laid it on the small table between them. Lakeside Landing. I read the title aloud. "It looks very modern." Sarah's face went white. Mark dropped his newspaper onto his lap. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant buzz of the ski boat's engine turning over. "Mom, I can explain," Sarah finally stammered. "Can you?" I asked, looking her directly in the eye. "Because I seem to remember you telling me last night that this was all just idle chatter. This looks a lot more serious than chatter." Mark cleared his throat and picked up the brochure, pretending to look at it for the first time. "Now, Evelyn, let's not jump to conclusions. A realtor just dropped this off. We were looking at it out of curiosity, that's all." "A realtor dropped it off," I said, my voice hardening. "That's funny, because there's a sales agreement tucked inside, with a price. A very low price." Sarah shot a panicked look at Mark. He was clearly the one she was following in this scheme. He put on a calm, reasonable face, the one he used when he was trying to sell someone a bad idea. "It's a preliminary offer, Evelyn," he said smoothly. "Just a starting point for negotiations. We were going to discuss it with you, of course. We were waiting for the right time. We didn't want to upset you." "Upset me?" I let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "You think lying to me and planning to sell my home from under me wouldn't upset me? You think offering it up for a fraction of its worth wouldn't upset me?" Kyle chose that moment to come stomping up the porch steps, dripping water from his swim trunks. "What's all the yelling about?" he demanded. He saw the brochure on the table and groaned. "Oh, come on. Are we really doing this now?" "Yes, Kyle, we are," I said, turning my attention to him. "This concerns you, too, since it's your future that this is all for." "It's for the best, Grandma," he said, crossing his arms with an air of supreme confidence. "This place is a money pit. You can't manage it anymore. It's time to be realistic. We could sell this and you could get a nice, small condo somewhere. No yard work, no repairs. It would be so much easier for you." His words were patronizing, dismissive. He spoke as if my life's happiness was measured in the absence of chores. He had no understanding of what this place meant, of the soul and history embedded in its very foundation. "I don't want easier, Kyle," I said, my voice rising. "I want my home. The home your grandfather and I built. The home where your mother grew up. A home you seem so eager to bulldoze for a quick payout." "It's not a quick payout. It's an investment in my future," he retorted, his face turning red. "Something you wouldn't understand. It's about building something new, not clinging to the past." "I understand more than you think," I said quietly, looking from his angry face to my daughter's guilty one, and finally to my son-in-law's false mask of calm. "I understand that you have all been lying to me, and I want to know why. Why the secrecy? And why the ridiculously low price?" Mark sighed, taking over the conversation again. "Evelyn, the market is what it is. It's a fair offer for a property of this age. It was another lie. I knew it. A property like this, with this much lake frontage, was worth at least 3 times what was on that paper. Something was very wrong. They were hiding something else, something bigger than just the sale itself. The confrontation ended there in a stalemate. They retreated into their flimsy excuses, and I retreated into a cold, determined silence. I knew I couldn't get the truth from them. I would have to find it myself. And I knew just who to call. My first call was to Arthur, my neighbor from across the lake. Arthur and his late wife, Mary, had been our closest friends for over 40 years. He was a retired land surveyor, and he knew this area better than anyone. He had a sharp mind and a healthy distrust of developers. "Arthur, it's Evelyn," I said when he answered the phone. "Evelyn, how are you doing over there with the whole clan visiting?" his voice boomed. "I'm managing," I said. "Listen, Arthur, I need to ask you a strange question. Have you seen anyone unusual around my property lately? Maybe a realtor, or someone looking things over?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, now that you mention it," he said slowly, "I have. A fellow in a fancy suit has been over there a few times in the last month. I saw your grandson, Kyle, with him on one occasion. I assumed you were thinking of selling." My heart sank. "Kyle was with him?" "Clear as day," Arthur confirmed. "They were walking the property line, all the way back to the woods. Seemed more interested in the back acreage than the house itself, which I thought was a bit odd." The back acreage. That was the undeveloped part of our land, a stretch of old-growth forest that Richard had always refused to touch. It was beautiful and wild. Why would a developer be interested in that? "Arthur, can I ask you another favor?" I said. "Can you tell me anything about a company called Oak Ridge Development?" "Can't say I've heard of them," he replied. "But I can do some digging. These little pop-up LLCs are usually just fronts for bigger players. I'll see what I can find." "Thank you, Arthur," I said, feeling a small flicker of hope. "It means the world to me." After I hung up, I sat at my computer. The phrase back acreage was stuck in my mind. I navigated to the county's public records website, a tool I had learned to use when I was fighting a proposed tax increase a few years back. I typed in my address and started searching through recent permits and applications related to my property and the surrounding area. It took some time, but then I found it. An application for a zoning variance. It was filed 2 months ago. The application requested that the land zoned as residential/conservation be changed to mixed-use commercial. The parcel of land described in the application was the undeveloped forest behind my house. My blood ran cold. This was bigger than just selling the house. They were planning to develop the entire property. The applicant's name was listed as Oak Ridge Development LLC. The contact information was A.P.O. Box. I stared at the address for a long time. It looked familiar. Then it hit me. It was the same P.O. box that my son-in-law, Mark, used for his consulting business. The one he bragged about getting because it had a prestigious zip code. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Mark was involved. This wasn't just him helping Sarah and Kyle sell the house. He was in business with the developer. The low price for the house was just the first step. It was a way to get control of the property cheaply. The real money was in the land, in getting it rezoned and turning our quiet piece of heaven into a commercial development. They weren't just selling my home. They were planning to destroy it. And they were using their family connection to do it in the most deceptive, underhanded way possible. They were trying to fleece me, just as Kyle had said. The anger I felt before was nothing compared to the cold, hard rage that now settled deep in my bones. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next piece of the puzzle came from Chloe. I found her in the kitchen later that day, looking miserable. The argument on the porch had clearly upset her. I poured her a glass of iced tea and sat down with her at the small kitchen table. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said, her voice small. "I hate all this fighting." "It's not your fault, dear," I told her. "You're caught in the middle of something you didn't create." We sat in silence for a minute, and then she looked at me, her brow furrowed. "There's something else," she said. "I don't know if it means anything, but I heard Kyle on the phone a few weeks ago. He was in his room, but he was talking really loud, bragging to one of his friends. What was he saying? I asked, my attention sharp. He was talking about his new business, she said. He said he had a silent partner who was helping him get the funding. And he said that once they unlocked the value in your property, he'd have all the seed money he needed. He laughed and said, he said it was easy because everyone just saw you as a sweet old lady who didn't understand business. A sweet old lady. The words were like a slap in the face. That's all I was to him. An obstacle, a relic, an easy mark. He wasn't just dismissive. He was actively plotting against me, viewing my love and trust as weaknesses to be exploited. He also said something about his dad having it all greased at the county office, Chloe added. He said the zoning change was a done deal. So Mark was pulling strings, using his connections to make this happen. This was a conspiracy, plain and simple, cooked up by my own family. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was a fundamental rejection of everything our family was supposed to stand for. It was a rejection of me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the moon casting long shadows across the room, and I thought about Richard and how he would have handled this. He wouldn't have shouted. He wouldn't have lost his temper. He would have been calm, methodical, and utterly ruthless. He would have gathered his ammunition, chosen his battlefield, and he would not have stopped until he had won. And that's what I decided to do. They wanted a fight? They would get one. But it would be on my terms. I started with small acts of resistance, little wrenches thrown into their well-oiled machine. The next morning, when Mark asked for the keys to the storage shed where the for sale sign was apparently being kept, I feigned confusion. The keys? I said, patting my apron pockets. Oh dear. I had them just yesterday. I can't imagine where they've gone. My memory isn't what it used to be. You know, I gave him a vacant, sweet old lady smile. He looked like he was about to explode. Later that day, I saw the realtor's car pull into the driveway. He was scheduled to take new photographs for the listing, the ones that would show off the property's development potential, just as he was setting up his tripod on the main lawn. The sprinkler system, which I had carefully reprogrammed, roared to life. A massive arc of water soaked the realtor, his expensive camera, and the entire area he had planned to photograph. Oh, goodness. I cried, rushing out onto the porch. That silly timer. It has a mind of its own. The realtor, sputtering and dripping, was not amused. He packed up his wet equipment and left in a huff. From the corner of my eye, I saw Kyle watching from an upstairs window, his face a mask of pure fury. It was a small victory, but it felt wonderful. The pushback, of course, led to escalation. That evening, Sarah and Kyle cornered me in the living room. Mom, what is wrong with you? Sarah demanded, her voice sharp with frustration. First the keys, now the sprinklers. Are you trying to sabotage this? Sabotage what, dear? I asked innocently. The plan to sell my home that you swore you weren't making? This is exactly why we need to sell. Kyle burst out, his voice cracking with anger. You're not capable of managing things anymore. You're forgetting things. You're messing with the sprinklers. You're acting senile. The word hung in the air between us. Senile. It was the ultimate weapon, the final dismissal. They weren't just saying I was old. They were trying to declare me incompetent, to strip me of my agency and my right to make my own decisions. It was a cruel, calculated blow, designed to make me doubt myself. But it had the opposite effect. It extinguished any last flicker of doubt in my mind. It hardened my resolve into something unbreakable. I am not senile, Kyle, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I am angry, and you have mistaken my kindness for weakness for the very last time. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. I went out to the porch and called Arthur. Arthur, it's me, I said when he answered. How is the research coming? Evelyn, I'm glad you called, he said, his voice grave. I found something. Oak Ridge Development is a shell corporation, as I suspected. It was incorporated just 6 months ago. And I found the name of the primary investor. It's not Mark. Who is it? I asked. It's his brother David, Arthur said. You remember David, don't you? The one who was involved in that shady land deal over in Mill County a few years back. I remembered. David was the black sheep of Mark's family, a man with a reputation for cutting corners and leaving his partners in the lurch. So Mark wasn't just in business with a developer. He was in business with his own corrupt brother. This was getting darker and more complicated than I could have imagined. But that's not all, Arthur continued. I was thinking about what you said about Richard, about how much he loved that land. And I remembered something he and I talked about years ago when we first bought our properties. He was worried even back then about developers getting their hands on this lake. So I went down to the county records office myself. I pulled the original deed for your property. And I prompted, holding my breath. And it's there, Evelyn, in black and white. A covenant attached to the deed. Richard must have put it in when he drew up his final will. It states that any sale of the property requires the unanimous written consent of all his direct heirs. That means you and Sarah. I knew that part, I said. Sarah is my heir. Yes, but there's more, Arthur said, his voice filled with triumph. There's a second clause. A poison pill, he used to call it. It states that if the property is ever sold, in whole or in part, to a commercial developer or for any non-residential purpose, 50% of the total sale value must be donated to the Northwood Land Trust for the preservation of wild spaces. I sank into the porch swing, my legs suddenly weak. A poison pill. It was the perfect description. Richard, my brilliant, forward-thinking husband, had seen this coming. He had built a fortress around our home, a legal barrier against the very greed that was now trying to tear it down. Sarah and Mark either had no idea this clause existed, or they were hoping I had forgotten about it. They thought they were going to get a massive payday from developing the land. But Richard's final act of love and protection had ensured that if they did, half of their profits would vanish. Arthur, you're a miracle worker, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Richard was the miracle worker, Evelyn, he replied gently. I just remembered where to look. Now, what are you going to do with this information? I looked out at the lake, shimmering in the twilight. The annual reunion barbecue was scheduled for the next day. The whole extended family would be there. Kyle and his friends had been planning a big beer pong tournament, a loud, boisterous affair that I usually avoided. But now I saw it differently. It was the perfect stage. A public arena where the arrogance of youth would be on full display. It was there that I would make my stand. I'm going to play a game, I said to Arthur. And I'm going to win. The next day, the reunion was in full swing. The lawn was crowded with family members, distant cousins, and old friends. The air smelled of grilled hot dogs and fresh-cut grass. On the patio, the centerpiece of the younger generation's activities was a long folding table, meticulously arranged with red plastic cups in a perfect triangle at each end. Kyle was holding court, a can of beer in his hand, his voice loud and boastful as he explained the rules to his friends. He was the king of his little kingdom, arrogant and untouchable. I watched from the doorway for a while, gathering my strength. I had the copy of the deed that Arthur had sent over tucked safely in my apron pocket. I had the truth on my side. All I needed was the right moment. Sarah and Mark were circulating among the guests, laughing and chatting, playing the part of the perfect hosts. They had no idea that their carefully constructed plan was about to come crashing down around them. I took a deep breath and walked out onto the patio. The music was loud, and the chatter was even louder. I walked right up to the beer pong table. A few of Kyle's friends looked at me with confusion. "Everything all right, Grandma?" one of them asked politely. "I'm just fine," I said, my eyes fixed on my grandson. I was just wondering what all the commotion was about. Kyle turned, a smirk already forming on his face. He saw me looking at the table, at the cups filled with beer. The smirk widened into a condescending grin. "It's beer pong, Grandma," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the patio to hear. He gestured to the table as if explaining a complex scientific concept to a small child. "You probably don't know what it is." It's a game for young people. Then came the words I had been waiting for, the words that would seal his fate. You're too old for this, he said, and then he laughed. A few of his friends chuckled along with him. A hush began to fall over the patio as people nearby turned to see what was happening. Sarah, noticing the shift in atmosphere, started to walk over, a worried look on her face. I ignored her. I looked Kyle dead in the eye. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and sharp, and it cut through the noise like a knife. I'll make you a deal, Kyle, I said. He raised his eyebrows, amused.
A deal?
What kind of deal? One game, I said. You and me. Right now. A murmur went through the crowd. Kyle's friends looked at each other, stifling laughter. My grandson looked utterly delighted by the absurdity of the situation. You want to play me? He said, incredulous. Grandma, you've never even held a ping-pong ball. One game, I repeated, my gaze unwavering. And we'll play for something real. We'll make a wager. Mom, what are you doing? Sarah said, reaching my side and grabbing my arm. Don't be ridiculous. Come inside. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. I am not being ridiculous, Sarah. I am being very serious. I turned back to Kyle, who was now thoroughly intrigued. All right, I'm listening, he said, crossing his arms. What's the wager? This was the moment. I took a step closer to the table, making sure his parents could hear every word. If you win, I said, my voice ringing with conviction, I will sign the papers to sell this house tomorrow morning. No more questions, no more arguments. You win. The house is yours to sell. The patio went completely silent. Every eye was on us.
Kyle's jaw dropped.
He looked over at his parents. Mark looked stunned, but I could see a flicker of greedy excitement in his eyes. Sarah looked horrified. Mom, no, she whispered. You can't be serious. I am perfectly serious, I said. Then I turned my gaze back to Kyle, and my voice dropped, becoming hard as steel. But if I win, the sale is off. Not postponed, not reconsidered. Off. Permanently. We will never speak of selling this house again. I let that sink in for a moment. Then I added the final piece. And you, Kyle, I said, pointing a finger at him. If I win, you will walk over to that table, you will place your car keys in my hand, and you will not get them back until I decide you are mature enough to understand the meaning of the word respect. The challenge was laid. The stakes were impossibly high. The entire family was watching, waiting to see what he would do. For a second, I saw a flicker of doubt in Kyle's eyes. But his arrogance, his absolute certainty that he could not possibly lose to his own grandmother, quickly won out. The smirk returned to his face. You've got a deal, Grandma, he said, picking up a ping-pong ball. Get ready to pack your bags. He thought it was a joke. He thought it was a sure thing. He had no idea that I had been the ringer on my college table tennis team. He had no idea that my hand was as steady as a surgeon's. And he had no idea that I was not just playing for a house. I was playing for my life, for my husband's memory, and for the soul of our family. The game was on. We took our places at opposite ends of the table. A cousin I barely knew offered to act as referee. The crowd of family members pressed in around the patio, their faces a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and genuine tension. I could see Chloe on the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped together, her face pale with worry. I gave her a small, reassuring nod. I saw Mark whispering excitedly to Sarah, who looked like she was going to be sick. Ladies first, Kyle said with a theatrical bow, gesturing for me to take the first shot. No, thank you, I said calmly. You're the champion. You can have the honor. His ego swelled. He grinned, took a casual stance, and tossed the first ball. It sailed through the air and landed with a soft plunk directly into one of my cups. A few of his friends cheered. Kyle took a bow. According to the rules, I had to drink the beer in the cup. I picked it up, took a small, symbolic sip, and placed the empty cup aside. I did not drink alcohol, but I would not give him the satisfaction of making a fuss. Now it was my turn. I picked up a ping pong ball. It felt light and familiar in my hand. I took a deep breath, blocking out the noise of the crowd. I focused on the triangle of red cups at the other end of the table. I remembered Richard teaching me to shoot, not with a ball, but with a rifle. Breathe out, squeeze, don't jerk, he would say. I let my breath out slowly, my arm moving in a smooth, practiced arc. The ball flew straight and true, landing perfectly in one of his cups. A surprised, "Ooh," went through the crowd. Kyle's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He drank the contents of his cup quickly and set it aside. His next shot was hurried. The ball hit the rim of a cup and bounced off the table. My turn again. I took my time. I aimed, I breathed, I released. Another perfect shot. Another cup gone. The game continued like this. Kyle, fueled by arrogance and overconfidence, was a flashy player. He tried trick shots, bouncing the ball off the rafters, throwing it behind his back. Some of them worked, and I had to take a few more sips of beer. But many of them missed wildly. I, on the other hand, was a model of consistency. I did not try anything fancy. I just aimed for the center of the cluster of cups and let my steady hand do the work. Shot after shot, I landed the ball in its target. With every cup I eliminated, the crowd grew quieter, the tension thicker. The smug, amused looks on the faces of Kyle's friends were replaced by expressions of shock and then dawning horror. It came down to the final cup. We each had one cup left on the table. It was Kyle's turn to shoot. He was visibly rattled. His face was flushed, and a sheen of sweat was on his forehead. This was not how his triumphant public humiliation of his grandmother was supposed to go. He took a long time to aim, bouncing the ball on the table over and over. He threw. The ball hit the front edge of my last cup, teetered for a heart-stopping moment, and then fell off to the side. He had missed. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was my turn. One cup. One ball. I held the fate of my home in my hand. I looked across the table at Kyle. His face was a storm of anger, disbelief, and humiliation. I looked over at Sarah and Mark. Their faces were ashen. They finally understood that this was not a joke. This was real. I did not look at the cup. I looked at my grandson. "This is for your grandfather, Kyle," I said, my voice just loud enough for him to hear. Then I threw the ball. It sailed in a perfect, high arc, seeming to hang in the air for an eternity before it dropped, straight down, into the center of his last cup. There was a splash of beer, and then silence. A deep, profound, stunned silence. And then Chloe screamed with joy. The silence was broken. A few of my nieces and their husbands started applauding. The sound grew as more family members joined in. I had won. I walked slowly around the table until I was standing directly in front of my grandson. He was frozen, staring at the ball floating in his last cup. He couldn't seem to process what had just happened. "Keys," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. I held out my hand. He looked from my hand to my face. His eyes were filled with a furious, childish rage. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "It was a stupid game. We made a deal," I said, my voice like ice. "In front of the entire family. You gave your word. Now give me the keys." He hesitated. For a moment, I thought he was going to refuse, to throw a tantrum. Mark started to step forward, to intervene, but I shot him a look that stopped him in his tracks. This was between me and Kyle. Finally, with a look of pure hatred, Kyle jammed his hand into his pocket, pulled out his car keys, and slammed them down on the table. Then he turned and shoved his way through the stunned crowd, storming into the house. I picked up the keys. They felt heavy and cool in my palm. A trophy. But I wasn't finished. I turned to face my daughter and son-in-law. They looked like they had seen a ghost. "And as for the other part of our deal," I said, my voice carrying across the now silent patio, "the sale is off." "Mom, please," Sarah began, her voice pleading. "Let's talk about this inside." "There is nothing left to talk about," I said. "But there is something I need to show you." I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the folded copy of the property deed. I held it up for them to see. I know everything, I said, my gaze sweeping over them and then to the wider family, who were all listening intently. I know about your secret meetings with the realtor. I know about your shell company, Oak Ridge Development. I know about the plan to rezone the back acreage. I looked directly at Mark. And I know about your partnership with your brother, David. Mark went so pale, I thought he might faint. Sarah stared at him, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. She clearly hadn't known the full extent of his deception. But here's what you don't know, I continued, unfolding the deed. You don't know about the covenant your father, my husband, put in this deed. A clause that states that if this property is ever sold to a commercial developer, 50% of the sale price must be donated directly to the Northwood Land Trust. A wave of murmurs and gasps rippled through the family members gathered around. Your entire dishonest, greedy little scheme was for nothing, I said, my voice filled with the cold fury I had been holding back for days. You were never going to see that massive payday you were counting on. You tried to steal Richard's legacy. You tried to steal my home. And you lied to my face, to your own family, every step of the way. The public humiliation was absolute. Sarah burst into tears. Mark simply stood there, his face a slack mask of defeat. The family looked from them to me, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning understanding, and then to disgust. The party was over. The battle was won. I had saved my home. But as I looked at my daughter's weeping face, I felt no joy, only a profound and weary sadness. I had won, but I had broken my family to do it. In the hours that followed, the family reunion disintegrated. People made awkward excuses and left in a hurry, not wanting to be caught in the fallout. The house, which had been filled with noise and laughter, grew quiet and empty. Only Sarah, Mark, Chloe, and Kyle remained. Kyle had locked himself in his room and refused to come out. Sarah eventually found me on the porch, where I was sitting in the swing Richard had built, Kyle's car keys resting on the small table beside me. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Mom, she said, her voice hoarse.
I am so sorry.
I didn't answer immediately. I just watched the sun begin to set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Which part are you sorry for, Sarah? I finally asked, my voice flat. Are you sorry you lied to me? Are you sorry you tried to sell my home? Or are you just sorry you got caught? That's not fair, she whispered. I didn't know about all of it. I didn't know about Mark's brother, or that deed. I swear. But you knew the core of it, didn't you? I said, turning to look at her. You knew you were going behind my back. You knew you were treating me like I was incompetent, like my feelings and my history didn't matter. You stood right there and let your son call me senile. You let him disrespect me, and you said nothing. I was trying to keep the peace, she said weakly. Mark and Kyle were so convinced it was the right thing to do. They wore me down. Keeping the peace is not the same as enabling cruelty, Sarah, I said. You chose them over me. You chose their greed over your father's legacy. That was your choice. She started to cry again, deep, shuddering sobs. What can I do to fix this? I don't know if you can, I said honestly. Trust, once it's broken like this, doesn't just glue back together. You and I have a long road ahead of us. And it starts with you being honest with yourself about what you did. Our conversation was interrupted by Mark. He came out onto the porch, his face grim. He didn't look at me. He looked at his wife. We should go, Sarah, he said. We'll pack our things. Is that all you have to say, Mark? I asked. He finally turned to me, his eyes cold and hard. There was no remorse there, only the bitterness of defeat. It was a good business opportunity, he said. You're too sentimental. You're sitting on a gold mine and letting it rot. This gold mine is my home, I retorted. It's a place for family, not for profit. A lesson you clearly never learned. You tried to use your own family to swindle me. We have nothing more to discuss. He glared at me for a moment longer, then turned and went back inside without another word. Sarah gave me one last, pleading look before following him. Later that evening, after they had packed their car and left in a stony silence, Chloe came to find me. She sat down beside me on the swing. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," she said, her voice trembling. "I feel like this is all my fault. I should have told you everything sooner." I put my arm around her and pulled her close.
No, sweetheart.
"None of this is your fault. You were put in an impossible position. And in the end, you did the right thing. You told me the truth. That took courage." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I love this house," she said quietly. "I never want it to be sold." "It won't be," I said, squeezing her shoulder. "Not as long as I'm here to protect it." We sat there together for a long time, watching the stars come out over the lake. Our bond, at least, had been strengthened through this ordeal. The next morning, I was sitting on the porch with my coffee when Kyle emerged from the house. He had his backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked tired and defeated. He walked over to the table and looked at his keys. "I need to go," he said, not looking at me. "I have to get back for classes." "How are you planning to do that?" I asked. He finally looked at me, his eyes sullen. "I was hoping. Can I have my keys back?" "No," I said simply. His face flushed with anger. "That's not fair. You can't just keep them." "I can, and I will," I said, my voice firm. "We made a deal. You lost. Part of growing up is learning to accept the consequences of your actions. You acted with arrogance and disrespect. You treated me like I was nothing. The keys are a reminder of that lesson." "So, what am I supposed to do?" he whined. "Walk home." "You can call a friend," I suggested. "Or a taxi. Or you can take the bus. It runs twice a day from the town over. It will give you some time to think. To think about what it means to be part of a family. To think about how you treat the people who love you." He stared at me, his mouth agape, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The idea of taking a bus was clearly an alien concept to him. He sputtered for a moment, then seemed to realize it was useless to argue. He turned, muttering under his breath, and stalked off down the long driveway, his phone already in his hand, presumably calling for a ride. I watched him go, a small, petulant figure shrinking in the distance. I felt a pang of sadness for the young man he had become, but I did not regret my decision. Some lessons are hard, but necessary. I picked up his car keys and let them jingle in my hand. The house was quiet now, truly quiet. It felt peaceful. It felt safe. It felt like mine again. I had faced down the jackals in my own family, and I had won. But it had come at a great cost. My relationship with my daughter was in tatters. My son-in-law would likely never speak to me again. And my grandson saw me as his enemy. I looked out at the lake, calm and beautiful in the morning light. I thought about the future. It would be different now. I would no longer be the quiet, accommodating matriarch who kept the peace at all costs. I had found my voice again, the strong, determined voice that Richard had always loved. They had wanted me to be a sweet old lady. They had pushed and pushed until they had awakened a warrior instead. They finally learned what it feels like to be underestimated. They finally learned that I am not too old for anything. And I always play to win. The keys in my hand were proof of that. They were a reminder that sometimes, to protect the things you love, you have to be willing to break a few things along the way. Even if one of those things is your own heart.